Ukraine's struggle for freedom dragged the Russian army into the biggest crisis in its history. Especially southern Ukraine has turned into a hell for the Russians because of Kiev's offensive plans. The Russians are trapped in a large area stretching from the southern front lines of Ukraine to the Crimea. It seems that these heavy attacks will continue until the main target of the Ukrainians is liberated, the Crimean Peninsula. For the liberation of Crimea, the Ukrainian armed forces are trying to build a long offensive corridor connecting roads on the southern front lines. For this purpose, the Ukrainian troops had recently taken action, primarily on the Zaporizhia front line. Kiev's grand offensive plans routed the Russian troops in the Zaporizhia region here. The last 9 settlements were liberated from the Russians. However, the fierce attacks of the Ukrainian army still continue in this region. Ukrainian forces aim to advance and liberate the coastline front lines as well as Zaporizhia. In line with this goal, Kiev's next stop was the Russian-controlled port city of Berdyansk. The port city of Berdyansk is very important for both sides of the war. The city has a coast on the Sea of Azov. Here, the Russians aim to involve the navy in the war and open a strategic front against Kiev. But there's one small detail that Moscow overlooked. The major offensive plans carried out by the Ukrainian armed forces are supported by modern, high-level weapons, missile systems and combat vehicles provided by the West and the USA. The Ukrainian army is driving these Western vehicles into the field in the city of Berdyansk, as well as on the Zaporizhia front line. Western war vehicles had given the Ukrainian army a large area of dominance in Zaporizhia. Now it's time in Berdyansk, one of the Russian army's strongholds. These vehicles include the German Leopard 2 and the UK-made Challenger battle tanks. These 2 mighty battle tanks are also war beasts that are currently advancing on the Ukrainian Berdyansk front lines. Thanks to these Western tanks, the Ukrainian armed forces have now managed to break through the Russian defense on the Berdyansk front line by 2 kilometers. The Russians have their third army established after the first mobilization in Berdyansk, Melitopol, and on the left bank of the Dnipro, along with units from the senior 22nd Army and the 1st Elite Guard Army in these regions. The Russian army established a very serious defense line in about 14 months. Russian military bases, airports, and logistics routes were created. However, we see that none of them could withstand the attack by Ukraine. A month ago, the first line of defense of the Russian army was broke in here, and now the Ukrainian forces are crossing the second line of defense. Leopard 2 and Challengers, which have incredible functions in terms of armor and maneuverability, are building a safe corridor for Ukrainian infantry units in Berdyansk. Thanks to the successful artillery fire of these Western tanks, the Ukrainian forces can easily reach the Russian trenches in Berdyansk, and the Ukrainian troops advancing from the land can see that the Russian soldiers in this direction have already been neutralized. In other words, Ukrainian troops advancing from the land line are conducting more reconnaissance and detection operations in Berdyansk. The British Challenger and German Leopard battle tanks undertake most of the work. The city of Berdyansk was one of the most trusted front lines of the Russians, but the Russian defense in Berdyansk was useless. The fortifications in this city, which Putin praised, almost collapsed thanks to the Western tanks used by the Ukrainians. Valery Churkin, spokesman for the Joint Press Center of the Torai Direction Defense Forces, said that the advance of the Ukrainian army in the south is getting more and more violent with each passing day. In addition, Valery Churkin announced that the Ukrainian armed forces systematically put pressure on certain parts of the front, broke through the defenses of the Russian army in the southern trenches, and destroyed its positions. Western tanks in the inventory of the Ukrainian army on the front lines, such as those at Berdyansk, Melitopol, and Zaporizhia, contributed greatly to the attack plans of Kiev because the Russian army lost about 4,000 battle tanks, and Ukraine westernized and modernized its inventory. The Russian army doesn't seem to have much of a chance in this regard. So how did Ukraine make such serious progress in Berdyansk, one of Putin's most trusted front lines, in the last few days? Of course, the contribution of Western tanks to the progress of Ukraine is quite large, but the Russian troops in and around Berdyansk were curiously unresponsive to this advance by the Ukrainians. The reason for this has been much debated. However, the main reason why the Russians were helpless in this regard was the missile attacks carried out by the Ukrainian army in this city in the past few days. If you remember, the Ukrainians launched 11 Storm Shadow long-range missile attacks on the Russian military base in Berdyansk. The military administration of the city of Berdyansk noted that 11 explosions were heard in the city. Fire was seen in the airspace area and the sound of an explosion was heard. In addition, the armed forces of Ukraine officially confirmed that they hit the airspace in temporarily occupied Berdyansk. As a result of these mind-blowing attacks, the Russians lost their main headquarters in Berdyansk and their fuel and mineral oil depots. Russian attack helicopters and drones were recorded by satellites at the Berdyansk airport. Planet Labs satellite specifically detected Kar-52, Mi-8 or Mi-24 attack aircraft and 13 Kar-29 ship transporters. There were a total of 27 helicopters belonging to the Russian army at the airport. It was claimed that these aircraft were damaged as a result of the Storm Shadow missile attacks by the Ukrainian army and that the Russians carried these warplanes and helicopters to much more secure areas. For this reason, the Russian troops had to surrender to the 2 km advance of the Ukrainian army in Berdyansk with the Leopard and Challenger Western battle tanks. If Kiev maintains this advantage and the Ukrainian armed forces completely seize control of the southern front lines, including Berdyansk, there will be no obstacles to the liberation of Crimea from the Russians. So in which direction should Ukraine prefer to move forward besides Berdyansk in order to liberate Crimea? And what should be Kiev's approach to Crimea? For the Ukrainian army to reach Crimea and create a connecting corridor to the peninsula, they must seize control of most of the southern front lines. The most strategic area for this is the Kherson region. Most of the control in the region is in the hands of the Ukrainians, but there are still Russian forces in Kherson awaiting, regrouping, and planning attacks on the Ukrainian army. For this reason, the Ukrainian armed forces must completely end the Russian threat in Kherson. Besides Kherson, the Dnipro River region and the Kinburn-Spit Isthmus are among the critical areas. The Ukrainians can use attack boat groups in these two regions to repulse the Russians, especially using the connection of the Kinburn-Spit with the Black Sea. Apart from Kherson, Ukrainian forces must also maintain control of front lines such as Melitopol and Tokhmyk for the ground attack corridor in Melitopol. The Ukrainian armed forces had already carried out an attack in the past few days. The main military base area controlled by the Russians in this city was damaged as a result of the offensive operations of the Ukrainians, especially in Zaporizhia. While Kiev's offensive plans continued, the damage to one of the main Russian military bases in Melitopol dealt a heavy blow to Moscow's retaliatory strategies. Since the Russians could not use this military base, they could not provide support to Zaporizhia or the southern lines of Melitopol. In this way, the Ukrainians were one step closer to their plans to save Crimea. Just like the city of Melitopol, Tokhmyk is an important transit point in this corridor extending to the Crimea. Here, mostly Ukrainian partisan groups have suppressed the Russian troops and the Moscow authorities in this region. Therefore, the Russian forces cannot support Zaporizhia from here and cannot prevent the Ukrainians from advancing towards the Crimea. If the Ukrainian forces want to reach the Crimea, besides all this, they have to continue this war strategy until Novotroitsky. In addition, the Crimean border centers near this city are among the places that Ukrainians should control. For example, Armyansk city between the Crimea and the Ukraine border lines is a very suitable settlement for the main purpose of the Ukrainian armed forces. The latest events in the heated conflict between Russia and Ukraine, which has already lasted much longer than anyone anticipated, have astonished people all around the world. It has come to light that Russia has not only invaded Ukrainian territory illegally and caused appalling damage, but that it has also committed serious violations of international law during this conflict. It is well known that the leader of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky, has made numerous requests for Putin to be tried in an international court. This is in addition to the destruction that has been caused by the conflict. The International Criminal Court has at long last issued a ruling regarding the crimes that were committed against Ukraine following Vladimir Putin's most recent assault on the Dnipro region. Zelensky was finally able to achieve the goals he set for himself in this operation that was planned by Russia. A horrible operation took place in the Dnipro region of Ukraine and it targeted the country. This onslaught, which resulted in the deaths of a great number of soldiers, took place not only in the combat zone. As a consequence of this bombardment, several structures were also demolished and innocent individuals were among those who were injured or killed. In his most recent petition to the International Criminal Court, Zelensky asserts that the attacks on these regions constitute the gravest kind of wrongdoing. This time, the court agreed to issue an arrest warrant for Putin because it acknowledged the traitorous nature of the attack and considered it an unequivocal felony. In addition, deserters from the Russian army were enlisted by the Ukrainian military. These troops had previously served in the Russian military. These soldiers were unable to bear the brutal treatment, so in order to save their lives, they sought refuge in the Ukrainian army. In addition to the soldiers who showed up in court to testify, deserting commanders also agreed to speak in front of the judge. These troops desired to bring light not just to the atrocities that had been committed against Ukraine, but also to the conditions that existed within the Russian army. The Russian soldiers' goal is to raise the number of people who are dissatisfied with Putin by demonstrating how harsh the conditions were for those soldiers in the Russian army who were driven into the conflict. The words made by a Russian officer called Andrei Medvedev caused a significant shift in the agenda. After learning that a complaint had been lodged in the court, Medvedev, who had previously taken sanctuary in Norway after escaping the Russian army, presented himself to the court as a witness. The words made by Medvedev, who had volunteered to speak, were so cold they might stop your heart. To begin, Medvedev stated that Russia's claims that its strikes on communities were accidents were a blatant fabrication of their government's propaganda. He also asserted that Russia went into a panic when Ukraine began to obtain the upper hand in the fight against Russia, and that Putin is trying to scare Ukraine by taking these actions. He confirmed that missiles had been purposefully fired at villages that included innocent individuals and that Putin himself had given the instructions for this to happen. In addition to this, Medvedev stated that Russians are being handled in the same manner, according to the Russian commander. The soldiers who had been conscripted into the fight against their will had been sent to the front lines of the conflict, which slowed down the advancement of the Ukrainian army. To put it another way, he clarified that the deaths of these soldiers were not a cover-up. On top of that, these civilians are not even provided with military training to better prepare them to protect themselves. Even if all of these are rumors which have already caused quite a bit of disruption to the global agenda, the fact that they are actually true has caused everyone to stand up. The commander, who divulged a great deal of information about the workings of the Russian army, also disclosed astounding details concerning the military's perspective on mental health issues. According to the statements made by the commander, commanders were granted the authority to use an infinite amount of force against soldiers who attempted to flee the conflict, and the use of this limitless force involved killing as one of its components. The power they possessed was not the only resource at their disposal. Putin had given the order to the commanders that any soldier who attempted to flee the outposts was to be shot dead. Soldiers who were suffering from starvation and epidemics in situations where human rights were disregarded were put to death. These conditions led to the soldiers' deaths. These people who were killed were reported missing after they attempted to flee the area but were unsuccessful. The families of these individuals were completely unaware that their loved ones had passed away. They were reported missing and believed to be traitors, but they were unable to stop the soldiers from surrendering to the Ukrainian army. Some soldiers even stated that they would rather be taken by the Ukrainian army than be a soldier in the Russian army. Additionally, men were fleeing from close quarters, even if it meant endangering their lives. On the other hand, it has come to light that Russia's primary motivation for bombarding the regions of Ukrainian territory in which citizens are located is the people who live in these places. This information was discovered. People were kidnapped from the area by sowing confusion, and then they were brought to Russia against their will and given citizenship. It was agreed that given this occurrence, which was carried out without giving Ukrainian citizens any choice, it should be defined as human abduction in the international court. As a result, it became clear to the eyes of the entire world that Ukrainian nationals were attempting to destroy not only their country, but also their identity in the process of doing so. Following all of this, a warrant for Vladimir Putin's arrest was issued after it was determined that he was guilty of a number of different offenses. On the other hand, Putin stated that he did not recognize the verdict of the International Court and did not accept this decision in any manner, shape, or form. In a subsequent statement, the Kremlin stated that it categorically rejected this decision and that Russian President Vladimir Putin was not guilty of any wrongdoing. It was also highlighted that what took place was due to the nature of war and that none of it could be considered a crime committed during wartime. This point was emphasized multiple times. A great number of nations continued to back the valiant Ukrainian army in its fight to win what is rightfully theirs. Putin's fury is growing by the day, and he is continually threatening the countries of Europe, despite the fact that all nations are giving as much assistance as they possibly can. The actions of Putin accomplish nothing but the recruitment of additional adversaries. The Western nations who do not pause for a second during their raid do not hesitate to proclaim at any chance that they will offer every possibility for Ukraine to win this war. This is something that they do not shy away from saying. The Ukrainian military is equipped with cutting-edge weaponry in order to participate in any and all actions. Russia is experiencing a great deal of unease as a result of the fact that the Ukrainian army now has access to modern weapons. It is estimated that the Russian army has used up more than half of its capabilities and is currently experiencing a scarcity of ammunition. On the other hand, the Russian soldiers, who are already in a precarious condition, are being terrified by the practically limitless might that the Ukrainian army possesses. In addition to this location, the governments of a great number of nations have extended an invitation to the inhabitants of Ukraine. These nations, who have made it clear that they are willing to take in refugees escaping war in their own countries, are ready and willing to provide assistance of any type. These trainings are not only supplied to new recruits who have enlisted to defend their nation, but they are also provided on how to use the vehicle that has been sent. Some countries deploy their own troops to Ukraine in order to provide military instruction there. It is common knowledge that Russia sends its men to the front lines with only a few days of training and no prior knowledge. But it is also common knowledge that the Ukrainian soldiers are adding strength to their forces. Additionally, it is common knowledge that a significant amount of money is moving into Ukraine currently. Documentation of all the assistance that Ukraine has received can be found on their website, where they also discuss any new developments with the board in an open and honest manner. In spite of this, Russia does not participate in any of the damage records. Putin either avoided talking about the countries that were on his side or did not talk about those countries because he feared garnering reactions. He was concerned that adversarial nations would bolster their support for Ukraine if it became public knowledge that assistance was also being provided to Russia. However, it appears that Russia will no longer be able to conceal the assistance because Iran, which is known to be one of Russia's largest backers, has suddenly turned its back on Putin. This will make it impossible for Russia to continue to conceal the assistance. The International Court's verdict of guilty means that Vladimir Putin is now publicly implicated in a wide range of criminal activities. Iran, which had already been under bombardment from European countries since the start of the war, was unable to make any additional efforts to back Putin, since they would just draw more attention to themselves. It is now unknown how Russia intends to proceed with this conflict now that Iran has withdrawn its backing. Putin, who was angered by any assistance, no matter how small or how large it was for Ukraine, threatens these countries at every opportunity. Nevertheless, it is common knowledge that most countries no longer pay attention to Putin's threats. This information, which was distributed by British intelligence to a large number of media sources, has caused many people all around the world to stand up. The achievements of the Ukrainian military on the fronts have resulted in significant difficulties for the Russian forces, which has driven Vladimir Putin completely insane. The Ukrainian soldiers who are currently in a commanding position on the front lines of the conflict, thanks to the 8 soldiers coming to the Ukrainian forces, do not allow the Russian forces any breathing room. Putin invests every penny of Russia's income in the military sector, but this strategy has not been successful in the most recent days. Significant new events have taken place regarding Russia's ongoing invasion attempts in Ukrainian territory. The fact that significant explosions have taken place on Russian soil as a result of actions coordinated by Ukrainian forces is the aspect of these developments that is most important. The capacity of Ukrainian forces to organize such an attack on Russian territory has created a great deal of unease among both the Russian army and the Kremlin. Russia, which was caught off guard by an attack of this nature, can no longer be considered safe. People have begun to leave their homes and communities over a significant portion of Russia. People in Russia are now seeking to leave the nation, and they are saying in interviews that they are doing so because the war has spread to their territories and they do not feel secure living there. After this, the Ukrainian army carried out a series of highly effective operations which allowed them to piece by piece eliminate the central basis of the Russian army. The explosion in the outer quarter ignited the fire, which quickly spread and reached a height of meters. The Russian invaders were unable to hold off the power of the Ukrainian forces, and as a result they were forced to totally vacate the lands that they had first taken control of during the conflict. This subject is being discussed in virtually all of the world's publications at the moment. This unanticipated power exhibited by the Ukrainian military has astonished people all over the world. The Russian soldiers who first underestimated the conflict and believed that they would soon be able to leave with a triumph are no longer able to think in such a manner. One of the important details that stood out on the global agenda was that the conflict in Ukraine has spread further. The Ukrainian army, which has dealt great blows to the Russian invaders in the operation organized by the Ukrainian forces, starts a new operation without wasting any time, according to the latest reports. The operation was started by the Ukrainian forces. After this, the detailed report that had been created by the British Ministry of Defense on behalf of the battlefield had a significant impact on people all over the world. In these final days of the conflict, the Russian armed forces have placed a far greater emphasis on the importance of their air defense systems. The most crucial piece of information that was provided by British intelligence was that the Russian armed forces developed their defense systems while taking into account the ground actions that took place throughout the conflict. At this moment, however, with the recent operations that were conducted by Ukrainian troops, the Russian army, which was aware of the significance of air defense systems but was unable to develop them in any way, started to see a significant increase in difficulty. The Russian military, which immediately after the Russian invasion of Ukrainian land on February 24, conducted numerous studies to build air defense systems, is still more vulnerable to a deep air attack from Ukrainian forces. This is the case despite the fact that the Russian military invaded Ukrainian territory. The long-range Patriot missiles, which were activated at a critical period when the Russian army was in this scenario, started to generate a lot of issues for the land that was under Russian control. The fact that Moscow is inside the range of the Patriot missiles is the root cause of all of these issues. The Russian military has recently been at a loss as to how to go against Ukrainian soldiers, given the amount of power that is currently in their possession. The most recent operation carried out by Ukrainian forces provided further evidence that the air defense systems utilized by Russian forces are antiquated. An unanticipated operation was carried out by Ukraine on the Russian air facility at Engels. The war's entry onto Russian territory is prompting residents of many different places to experience high levels of worry. The battles fought with air strikes were significantly altered as a result of this attack on the Engels airbase. This small base, which was very significant to the army and was found in the Saratov region of Russia, was located there. The very sophisticated drones used by the Ukrainian forces were able to take out a strategically significant airbase used by the Russian military. The Russian aircraft had trouble taking off and did not respond to the threat. An airstrike carried out by Ukrainian forces claimed the lives of 3 Russian soldiers who were participating in this operation. Following the assault that took place within Russia, the Kremlin issued a red alert upon learning of the incident at each and every airbase in Russia. Significant security measures and air defense systems have been upgraded as a direct result of an order. According to the information provided by the aircraft, all of the aircraft based in Russia's air bases were transferred to outposts with greater security importance, and hangars appear to have generated a great deal of worry among Russian soldiers. The war between Ukraine and Russia is in full swing. The flames of the war in Ukraine have spread into Russia in the last 4 months. The mass protests that started after the partial mobilization announcement continued in the second week of the new year. Russian protesters have damaged many government buildings since the announcement of partial mobilization. Explosions and fires occurred at 78 military registration and enlistment offices, military bases, warehouses, and other military facilities in Russia and Crimea. They set fire to military registration and recruitment offices and recruitment centers 46 times in Russia. The first case occurred in February, 4 days after the start of the war. A 21-year-old living in Lukhovitsky near Moscow broke 2 windows of the local military registration and enlistment office and threw bottles of Molotov cocktails into it. Cases of arson in Russia were recorded every month after this incident. However, after the partial mobilization announcement, fire and explosion incidents peaked in Russia. There have been 32 fire incidents in the last 3 months and other facilities in Russia, including military units, ammunition depots, airports, and other buildings associated with the military and industrial complex, in particular facilities in the Moscow region. Belgorod region and Crimea became the focal point of fires and explosions between December and January. Multiple fires and explosions occurred in the same day on the territory of the peninsula. Cases of arson were found at Crimea airports, an ammunition depot, and a military unit. Also, a large number of fires were recorded, including the Navy arsenal in the Yaroslavl region and the ammunition depot near Belgorod. Let's take a look at the recent fires and explosions in Russia in the middle of this week. A huge fire broke out in warehouses in Moscow, the capital of the Russian Federation. It was recorded that more than 2,000 meters squared of the area was engulfed in flames. The roof of one of the buildings has already collapsed. Helicopters were called to extinguish the fire. The Moscow Metropolitan Prosecutor's Office also launched an investigation into the fire, especially in the last 45 days. Mysterious fires and explosions have occurred in and around Moscow. In December, 2 large shopping malls in Moscow mysteriously burned down. Explosions occurred at a large military installation near the Kremlin, and even the Kremlin residents felt the jolts of the explosion. In addition, fire broke out in 3 railway station buildings in the center of Moscow last month. The fire also engulfed a 2-story brick warehouse building on Komsomolskaya Square Building 1, a Building 18, according to open sources. The building at the address where the fire broke out includes a furniture and lighting store and a flower shop. The fire area is about 2,000 meters squared. 2 people were reportedly trapped in the building that caught fire. The ceilings between the first and second floors of the building have partially collapsed. 3 Russian Ka-32 helicopters and a fire train served to extinguish the fire. After this situation, an explosion occurred in a 5-story building in the village of Timovskoye in the central part of Sakhalin, as a result of which the entrance to the building collapsed. Also, the ceilings between the apartments from the 2nd to the 5th floor collapsed. At least 9 people, including 4 children, died in the accident. 7 injured were transferred to the hospital. Rescuers continued to remove the debris. The governor said there were probably 2 more people under the rubble. In parallel with this, there is an evacuation of residents at the neighboring entrances where the doors were broken in by an explosion. Russian authorities are planning to place them in the House of Culture. The governor announced that gas was not supplied to the house where the explosion occurred. According to the authorities, the explosion allegedly occurred due to improper storage of the gas cylinder lying horizontally on the balcony. In addition to traditional military facilities, fires occurred twice in the past month on the territory of the Research Institute of the Russian Ministry of Defense in Tver and in the building of a gunpowder factory in Perm. On the other hand, on November 30, 2022, a large-scale fire broke out in the Bryansk region of Russia on the border. This was announced by the governor of the region, Alexander Bogomazov. Tanks filled with fuel caught on fire in one of the oil depots. The incident occurred in the Saraj district. Local media claimed that the fire started after the explosion. At the same time, the local Russian authorities refused to give a reason. The fire area reached 4,000 meters squared. In total, the fire was reported to be under control. At the same time, a fire broke out in Perm at the city's largest thermal power plant. Huge clouds of smoke appeared over the city. All emergency services of the city were withdrawn to CHP territory. Hundreds of people were evacuated. The main steam pipeline at the Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk thermal power plant was Damage due to the emergency. Electricity was cut in some areas. The emergency shutdown occurred over the weekend. Those living in the south of the island were without electricity. On the other hand, this week an explosion occurred in the gas pipeline between Berdyansk and Kovaleva in the Leningrad region. There is a pipeline to Nord Stream 1 in the area of the explosion. Regional Governor Alexander Drozdenko stated that firefighters and rescuers put out the fire caused by an explosion in a natural gas pipeline between Berdyansk and Kovaleva. According to the governor, there is no threat to the population and residences to spread the fire. The Ministry of Emergencies of the Russian Federation said that in the Zavolzhsky district of the Leningrad region, a pressure drop in the gas pipeline was followed by a fire. It was reported that there was a pipeline going to Nord Stream 1 in the area where the explosion occurred, as the Current Affairs YouTube channel. All of our findings are created by the work and analysis of our field warfare expert team and are based on data from US, UK, Russia, and Ukraine, Ministries of Defense, and independent war analysis and monitoring sources. In addition, Sweden announced that heavy sabotage was found in the explosions at the Nord Stream 1 and 2 gas pipelines. Prosecutor Mats Lundqvist, who led the preliminary investigation into the explosions in the Nord Stream 1 and 2 natural gas pipelines in Sweden, stated at the press conference that the incident was complex and comprehensive and that there was heavy sabotage in the findings. Lundqvist stated that they found a large number of foreign objects and explosives in the area where the analyses were carried out. Lundqvist said that as a result of the ongoing investigation, it will be revealed whether anyone is guilty as a result of extensive research on the explosion in the future. It was reported that there were 4 leaks in the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines belonging to Russia near Denmark and Sweden, and warning was given that ships should not approach the area. Both countries said that there were indications that the leaks were the result of deliberate action, not accident. The EU also noted that gas leaks in pipelines were the result of a deliberate action, not accidental. The Swedish intelligence service launched an investigation into the incident. The Danish Energy Agency announced that gas leaks in the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines had stopped. Russian emergency company Gazprom also announced that the pressure in the pipelines had returned to normal and the leaks had ended. Meanwhile, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, in a statement on the subject, stated that it's very important to find those responsible for the attack on the pipelines. Peskov stated that Sweden's findings that there may be sabotage or terrorist attack related to the investigation confirmed the information in Moscow's hands. A Kremlin spokesman said Moscow would wait for the damage assessment report before making a decision on whether to repair the pipeline again. Gas supplies from Russia to Germany in the Nord Stream 1 pipeline were cut off at the end of August. Nord Stream 2 pipeline never made a supply to Europe because of the sanctions that followed its invasion, which began in February. According to the Swedish Navy's statement, Nord Stream AG, the operator of the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, has been given permission to examine the area where the leak occurred in the pipeline. According to the shared statement, a Russian flagship provided by Nord Stream AG came to the region and conducted an inspection. In the statement of the Swedish Navy, it was stated that they continued their investigations and are in communication with the Russian ship supplied by Nord Stream AG. Since February 2022, the most damaged side has been the Russian side, Russia, which has suffered enormous economic and human power losses both at home and on the battlefield. Will add more to its losses as long as it continues to wage the war. In particular, arson incidents within Russia are irreparable losses for Russia, whose economy has already bottomed out due to global sanctions.